Welcome to the 10 Methods lecture for Parkway North's AP World History class. I'm Scott Nilsson, and in this session we're going to discuss a question near and dear to rulers all over the world, both in the present and in the past. It's a simple question, really. Now that you've got power, how are you going to keep it? As we talked about before, during this time period we have the development of the first states scattered about in 6 areas of the world: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus River Valley, the Shang dynasty in China, and the Olmec and the Chavin in the Americas. All of the rulers in these areas face the same challenge. Now that they've got power, what are they going to do with it, and how do they keep it? Quite independently, these 6 civilizations settled on 10 methods of keeping power: military power, or keeping control through force; social stratification, or organizing society into social classes; legal codes, or having systems of laws that apply to everyone in the society; writing, or recording the important transactions and rules in the society; monumental architecture, or creating great monuments for a religious or a political purpose; urban planning, or organizing the layout of the city in a deliberate fashion; art, or using creative visuals for political purposes; literature, or the recording of ancient stories; trade, particularly trade between various regions; and religion, or using beliefs in the supernatural for political purposes. Each of these civilizations implemented these solutions a little differently, but the same general principles hold true, essentially. We're going to talk about the first 4 methods in this lecture, and we'll talk about the last 6 methods in the next lecture. So, let's begin with military power. This is the oldest method, and frankly, still one of the most effective. If you're in power, you stay in power because you're in charge of a strong military. If someone starts agitating against you, you roll in with your superior army and make a spectacularly messy example of them. No fuss, no muss. Well, for your victim, there's plenty of muss, I suppose, but that's not really your concern if you're in charge. There's a couple notes to make about this. First, this method only works if you do indeed actually have a superior military. If your military is sufficiently weak, then your answer to the question of how do you keep power is that you don't. Complicating things for rulers at this time is that pastoralists on the fringes of civilization kept coming up with nifty military advances in technology. Things like horseback riding, or chariots, or composite bows, or bronze weapons. The pastoralists did this because it helped them eat. Horses allowed them to follow their herds more easily. Chariots provide a nice platform from which to hunt, and composite bows allow you, if you're good, and the pastoralists were, to kill fairly accurately from a distance. Introduce this new technology into the mix, and all of a sudden the pastoralists are the superior military power, which means they left their pastoral ways and put themselves in charge of new states. Go check out the Hittites and their chariots for a good example of this. Second, by answering the question of how to keep power through the military, you haven't resolved the question, you've just shifted it. The real question for you at this point is actually, how do I keep the military on my side? Because if you lose the military, then you lose your power. After all, they could decide they'd prefer to have someone more to their liking and just dump you, probably violently. Since you'd like to avoid this, you'd need to find some way of keeping the military on your side. So let's go, like most rulers at the time did, to the next method: social stratification. To stratify something means to put that thing in layers, or strata. Social stratification, then, is to put society into layers. In other words, to create social classes. This concept is really straightforward. Take a society and cut it into pieces, based more or less on job description. At the top, of course, are the royalty and the nobility, since they're the ones that are in charge. Next on down are the warriors, since they're the guys who are good at killing other people. And at the bottom is everybody else, the farmers and the peasants and the skilled laborers and the like. There's a layer for priests and other religious authorities too, though where that layer fell really depended on the society and on the religion. Sometimes it's at the top, sometimes it's not. Some societies had an even lower layer at the bottom for slaves, though again, that depended on the society and its views regarding slavery. This setup is really good at preserving power in the hands of those who have it. Since it's really hard to change classes, any direct challenge to a higher class will be resisted by the entirety of that class. So a revolt by a portion of the peasant class will be put down by all of the nobility and all of the military, since it's a challenge to all of them. A challenge by a portion of the military gets put down by the combined might of all of the nobility, as a challenge to one is a challenge to all. Plus, if religion gets mixed into the system as a way to justify the stratification, then a challenge to the status quo is a good way to get the gods angry, and that gets everyone nervous very quickly. This system works so well as a way of organizing society that the first legitimate challenge to it anywhere in the world that was even a little bit successful was the creation of the United States, the first nation deliberately created without hereditary social class. Similar changes didn't take place in Europe until the 1800s, and in most of the rest of the world, not until the last 100 years or so. For the 10,000 years that the AP cares about, this type of social stratification has been the default setting for most of the world for all but the last 1% of that time. As a side note for social stratification, similar changes happen in the family. Gender relations in so-called non-civilized societies are far more equal than when societies get civilized and settle down with cities and agriculture. Gender relations start to settle into a pattern called patriarchy, in which women are deemed to be lower and subordinate. This is another situation in which patriarchy is the 99%, with a couple exceptions here and there, most of which have happened in the last century, or, arguably, just within the last 40 years. Back to social stratification, though. What rulers found relatively quickly is that the system becomes that much more effective if the informal divisions between social classes are hardened and made formal through the creation of rules that apply to everyone in the society. Another word for that system of rules is law, which is our next method. Legal codes. Let's illustrate this concept through an example first. Hammurabi was a Babylonian king who promulgated a code of laws. Unexcitingly, these laws are called the Code of Hammurabi. The code is famous for a couple things. It's one of the very first examples of written laws. They were published on a pillar in a public place so that anybody could read them. Well, anybody who could read, that is. It's also famous as a very early example of the law of retaliation, which is the eye for an eye kind of law. For our purposes, it's also fascinating in that it prescribes different punishments for different classes of people. Peasants are punished more harshly than nobles, and doing something bad to a noble gets you a harsher punishment than doing that same bad thing to a peasant. This, of course, allows for state-sanctioned repression of peasants. Heck, arguably the gods required peasants to be repressed, since Hammurabi claims in the code that the gods gave the laws to him to bring to the people. All in all, this is fairly clever, though the laws gave the peasants some protection, but not as much as the nobles received. In this way, the peasants had an incentive to uphold the law, otherwise they'd lose their protections, which in turn upheld their subordinate place in the society. It's the bird in the hand thing, and the upshot was to keep those who were in power safely lodged in that power. Writing. This all kind of presumes that you can write the laws down in the first place, though, doesn't it? Which means you have to have a system of writing or recording things such that everybody can understand them. Each of the 6 ancient civilizations did this independently, and they all did so for more or less the same reason. The vast majority of early writing in Mesopotamia, for example, was focused on recording commercial transactions. How many cattle did this farmer have, and what was their sale price, and so on. The ancient Mesopotamians, you see, had stumbled onto a key insight into civilized life. There's so much going on that you'll forget it all if you don't write it down. Writing also helped those in power stay in power for a couple reasons. First, if you know how many cattle your friendly neighborhood farmer has, then you know exactly how much to tax him, and taxes are, of course, an excellent way to stay in power. Second, if you write down all the important rules in your society, then those who can read are the ones who know what the rules are. If you can't read, then you just have to take the word of those who can. And if you can write, then you can change the rules if you need to. If you can't, then you can't. The key, then, is that only elites had the ability to read and write, which meant that they had the power and could preserve it simply by restricting education. Okay, this is a good place to pause. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the last 6 methods for keeping power: monumental architecture, urban planning, art, literature, trade, and religion. As soon as you're ready, head over there.